Now you're ready to start with your watercolor techniques. So you'll have all the materials that you need on your desk. You'll have watercolor colored pencils, which I will show you how to use. You'll have a marker, a crayon, rubbing alcohol, your paints, your water cup and your paintbrush, your salt, and a paper towel. Those are all the materials that you'll need for your techniques. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with something called wet on dry, which is your normal way of painting with watercolor, getting water on your brush, getting paint on your brush, and simply painting something. You're using wet watercolor paint on dry watercolor paper. The next technique you're going to do is called wet on wet. So you're going to wet your paper first. You're going to wet the one area that you're working in. You can use the same color, different colors. You can try different things. What I want you to notice is with wet on wet, you have wet watercolor and wet paper. When you paint, the colors are going to kind of move around because your paper is already wet. So you can see the difference, the big difference between wet on wet and wet on dry. Okay? Your next technique that you're going to do is called dry brush. So you're actually going to dry out your brush mostly. You still have to have a little bit of water on it. And you're going to get a color and you're going to paint. This is good for texture because you can see that it's not just a solid line like that and it's not moving around like the wet on the dry, but you can see the brush strokes and you can see how it kind of looks dry. It doesn't look very wet at all. The next thing you're gonna do is a wax resist. So you're gonna take a crayon, you're gonna press down pretty hard, and you're going to draw something. It doesn't matter what it is. Maybe it's some sort of pattern, maybe you're writing your name, maybe you're drawing some shapes. But the key to the wax resist is that you really do have to press down pretty hard in order for it to be able to have enough wax on there to resist the watercolor paints. Okay? Then after you do your wax crayon, you pick a color, it doesn't matter which one, or maybe you do several colors, and you are painting over top of your wax. When you paint over top of that wax crayon, the wax will resist the watercolor and you'll still be able to see it. Another technique that you can use is called rubbing alcohol. So to use the rubbing alcohol, you're going to paint on your paper, and you have to do this one fairly quickly. You're going to add some colors to your paper, to the area that you're trying to do the technique for. Doesn't matter how many colors you use, maybe you just want to use one color, it's up to you. And then you have your rubbing alcohol and your Q-tip. The rubbing alcohol, when it touches the watercolor, it creates kind of a resist like the wax did. You can draw with it and it will kind of push the watercolor away. You can splatter it on there and it creates an interesting effect, or you can dot it on and it will create kind of like what they call a fisheye effect. Okay, so that's rubbing alcohol. For the salt, you start the same way. Pick a color or two, paint your area. Now salt is a delayed effect. So you're gonna start by painting the area, then you're going to put just a little bit of salt. You don't need hardly any salt, just a little bit. And as the watercolor dries, the salt will kind of absorb the color, and then it leaves kind of a neat texture in the end. Watercolor colored pencils, you draw something just like you would with regular colored pencils. They look just like regular colored pencils. You would draw something, add some color. You can blend watercolor colored pencils really well, which is a nice feature of them. If you color in 15 different directions, it's going to remain like that. It's not, you still have to color fairly neatly in order to get it to look good in the end. Once you draw with your watercolor colored pencils, you can then paint over top of them with just water. You just add water, and then it kind of blends them together and has a pretty interesting looking effect. It's neat to be able to see the way that the colors kind of blend together, and how what once was colored pencil is now turning into a paint. And you don't want to just take your water and your paintbrush and just paint over the whole thing. You still have to kind of paint it individually. But that's kind of fun to do. And then another one that you're going to try is marker. Because these are water-based markers, they will bleed when you get them wet. So it will kind of take the color. It's not real bold color, but it will take the color from the marker by just adding some water to it, and it kind of pulls some of that color in there. All right, another technique that you're gonna try is going to be blot. So to blot, you get paint on your paintbrush, paint the area that you're gonna wanna paint. This technique is used really well when you're trying to create something like clouds. You can use blot. Then you take your paper towel, ball it up, and blot some of the color off. And then the last technique that you're gonna do is a gradient, a color gradient. So you pick one color, and let's say I'm gonna do green. I'm gonna get a lot of paint on my brush, and I'm gonna start on one side, and it's gonna be darker. And then as I start to go over, I'm just gonna add some more water to my brush, and it goes from dark to light. So that's a gradient. It's like value, creating value with watercolor. And that's your watercolor technique project.